Sweet. The resolution is that this House would revoke the executive order. The A point is that this is going to be a policy round because we believe that both words would and should imply policy action. The B point is that this round will be based on net benefits because it allows for an equal weighting mechanism at the end of the day for the judge to decide who wins at the end of the debate round. That's the background. The first argument here is that Western States Debate Tournament is a very unique forum, especially for debaters across the country. We would argue that it's mobile based on the location of the Western States Communication Association Conference, which makes it specifically unique to not only the people that live here in Reno, but also the people that come out of the region to come debate here. The second argument under here is that norms are created about things like the number of breaks for Parley, for LD, for British Parley, as well as the bracket lineup and whether or not half of the field's clear. We would argue that the third argument underneath the background is that this always creates confusion and conflict when the tournament director gets to make the final calls. We see that this allows for a lack of discussion about how schools feel about the decisions that are being made, as well as the fact that there's no inclusion as to alternative perspectives. And we believe this uniquely affects not only both of us in this debate round, but also the people that are watching who may or may not have broken because of the specific rules that have been created because of the executive orders that we talked about in our background. Also, we would argue that there have been no set rules, which is what allows for the executive directors of the tournament to make these calls in the first place, which we would argue is extremely problematic, especially when we come here looking forward to enjoying a debate tournament. Our fourth argument under the background is that the tournament invite should lay out the standards for things like this, like all of the things that I specifically said about in the background of previously, but as well as the number of rounds in LD. And we would argue that with this has led to things like these things not happening, as well as a lack of transparency of what's going on in the tournament, as well as a lack of input from debaters, as well as specific schools and coaches. Our fifth argument is that because these standards change, these standards that change the tournament enrollment, we would argue that these aren't the standard practices for either NPT or NPDA or the specific community colleges that come here to debate. We would also argue that this has eliminated a lot of education that could have happened in this tournament because of the fact that there are less rounds being created, and also the fact that people are being prevented from breaking into out rounds, which we would argue is a unique detriment to not only the education of this debate tournament, but also a unique detriment to the education of debate in general. We would argue that this hurts the credibility of the tournament. Our argument here is not that we are indicting the executive director of this tournament. I want to make that extremely clear. Our specific delineation is that the fact that this should be a transparent process, and she should never even be put in a position like that where she has to make these decisions, because in a world in which there is more discussion and more input, this is always going to create for better education and better inclusion within the debate community in general. That's our plan text. The board for the Western Forensic Association will remove the tournament director's ability to make executive orders about the tournament. The board for the Western Forensic Association will remove the tournament director's ability to make executive orders about the tournament. That's our solvency. Yeah, I'll get to the bottom of solvency.
Just a text, please.
Oh yeah, go ahead. The first argument under the solvency is that now the board has to agree on the procedures of the tournament. We specifically see that places like NPT and NPDA having a board is what prevents these kinds of things from happening. We would argue that this is always going to be best because the more inclusion and the more voices being heard about these kinds of decisions is always going to be better. Our second argument under the solvency is that removing the executive order means that they must clearly delineate the rules ahead of time, and in the invites. Our argument specifically here is that there should not be any flexibility of changing procedures, especially in the middle of a debate round or in the middle of a debate tournament, when you come here expecting a very unique set of rules that are going to protect the fairness and the education of the debate community. We would argue that specifically of having a board being able to approve all of these decisions ahead of time is always going to check back for these kinds of abuses that we've seen specifically here at this tournament. The third argument under the solvency is that our example specifically here is that the Pacific tournament, there was an issue about dropping a round or giving double wins in one of the rounds because of the fact that the resolution that was said it was different in a couple different places. Our argument specifically here is that Marlon was able to discuss with all of the schools as well as the coaches and open up to a vote, which we would argue is always going to be uniquely beneficial for debaters as well as for the schools that are sending debaters to these tournaments in the first place. We would argue that whether or not the decision was respected is pretty irrelevant, especially because in a world in which you're able to vote for things like this and have your voices heard, that's always going to be better than disagreeing with the decision. Thus, we would argue that transparency and a system where people are able to voice their concerns and vote based on those concerns is always going to be more beneficial. That's our first advantage. It's that of community cohesion, the uniqueness. The one is that the controversy of this tournament, about the director's decisions specifically have been controversial. We see this specifically like cutting an LD round and not breaking winning records was something that has hurt a lot of individuals at this tournament, but also we would argue that not breaking half the parlay field has not only affected NPT points and credibility within the NPDA system, but it also means that people have a lack of education about some of the topics that we've been discussing at this tournament, which we would argue is a unique benefit of passing our plan. We would also say that there should be a process of there should be a process, right? We're not criticizing the individual, we're simply saying that there should be a process by which people are able to voice their concerns and to be able to vote at the end of the day of what they think the best decision to be made would be. That's the link. The first link argument is that the plan creates the conditions to clarify the process, which we would argue is always going to be most beneficial. The second argument is that this will increase the tournament credibility, which would allow for more participation. The third argument under the link is that this allows for the creating of new bonds with schools that we don't usually see. Our argument specifically here is that Western Saints is a very unique form because it allows for schools that don't usually get to interact with one another to actually come together and create community bonds and community cohesion, which is always going to be best for things like debate specifically, because in a world in which some of the best, like the greatest minds of our college communities across the nation come here to join and talk about all the things that are, all the adversities that are facing us, as well as specifically the things that are going on in the debate community, is always going to be something that we should discuss, especially in a world in which we think that all of our opinions and all of our all of our arguments about the way that a tournament should run are specifically important. Thus, the impacts. We would argue this decreases all conflict with specifically decisions that are made based on tournament processes. We would also argue that this increases participation. We would say that more community building in the debate community is always going to allow for more support for difference. We would argue that this specifically helps keep attrition down. We see that specifically people of color and women are always kicked out of the debate community. We see that like in the lower stages of debate there are always a plethora of these individuals, but in a world in which like decisions like this are continuing to be made and push people out and not allow for their voice to hold any sort of credibility, this is always going to argue. This is always going to be a way in which to keep these people out of debate, which prevents our ability to create policies, become social theorists, and create movements as well as allies for those movements. We specifically would say that debate is a very unique place where individuals are able to gather and formulate new ideas about how the world works and allow for theories to be based on things that we discuss in debate rounds as well as specific movements. We would argue specifically that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was something that was pushed by a debater, Josh Seafried. We would also argue that Sarah Mason, who was on the cover of Time magazine, is always going to be a reason as to why you should allow individuals like this to be able to voice their concerns. We would also argue that race and gender equality and inclusion forums, like such has been going on in the last couple of years, is always going to be a reason as to why you're going to be preferring the plain text, because it allows for the most inclusion of voices. Yeah, I'll get your question.
Yeah, the board for the, can you repeat text once more? I think Alex misread it.
The board of the Westman Forensic Association will remove the tournament director's ability to make executive orders about the tournament.
Thank you. All right. So, there's going to be a topicality on top. Obviously. The case in order. And then another off on the bottom. That last off may or may not come after the topicality. I'm going to start my timer and I'm going to think about this for a minute and then I'll start speaking. Everybody ready? Okay. But I don't think this exists. Yeah. First off, the topicality. We have two words that can be interpreted in today's resolution. The first is revoke. The definition of revoke is to annul by recalling or taking back. The second interpretation is executive order, specifically as was created in terms of literature in 1862, was created in order to form a regional court in the state of Louisiana by the United States federal government via the violation. First, you do not make a United States federal government action, thus violating the interpretation of the word executive order. But secondarily, you do not revoke anything because as you articulated in the original PMC that there are no rules that specifically guidelining giving the executive order privileges to the tournament director of the status quo means you do not revoke an executive order because the executive order simply does not exist. They never articulate to you where this isn't the WSA guidelines period that absolutely does not exist. It's not actually an executive order, and they are violating the entirety of the concept of the resolution. See, here are the standards. First is going to be that of the predictable negative ground, upon which Kelly and I came here to debate about the topic of executive orders as they are used in the literature by the United States federal government presidential policy action. We argue that is absolutely critical to solving back for 100% of the overall offense that the negative team could have been generating today. We absolutely agree with what they are saying. However, that is not the debate that was proposed by the resolution. We argue second standard is framers' intent, upon which we are not debating about what the framers originally intended for us to debate about today's resolution. However, they instead chose to make the debate about inclusion of individuals who may or may not have made it into break grounds. That is not topical whatsoever, not absolutely an executive order under the interpretation, and they are not revoking anything because it simply did not exist, right? That argument is just fundamentally true. The third argument is you utilize object fiat to the point in which you utilize the Western Forensics Association theory that is absolutely object fiat 100% is independent reasons why you should reject the affirmative team at the end of the speech. The voters first is going to be education. Voters are actually learning about executive orders, but rather learning about tournament procedures. We argue this is absolutely the wrong forum with which to do this. And if you all feel so strongly about this, we absolutely agree that you could have done this. Go to the conference, go to a WSCA tomorrow and argue that this should be done. Secondarily, so that's a wrong forum argument hidden in the topic. Secondarily, sorry, we're not learning about the specific heart of the topic or executive orders whatsoever, rather just tournament procedure. We argue this is not in the literature whatsoever. Secondarily, the third argument is competitive equity, the one which Kelly and I have been skewed out of today's debate round tonight. All of our pre-prepped arguments, that is the reason as to why you should vote on this argument a priori. However, secondarily, they're going to say it's only potential abuse. However, this is absolutely actual abuse of the pronoun. We can articulate the reasons as to why this first does not exist, second is not an executive order privilege, and third, the disadvantage that we have right here talking about how executive orders have been utilized by the United States federal government to prevent racism as well as the social change that has happened in the status quo. That is the debate that we were supposed to be having, and we think that is a very important issue as well as your affirmative is just in the wrong forum.
Yeah. Your interpret for XO.
Executive order is as it is historically defined, was created in 1862 in order to create a regional court in the state of Louisiana, and then I explained what that looks like and in terms of executive privilege for the United States federal government. Cool. Counterplan. The board of the Western States Communication Association will allow the tournament director to make executive orders about the tournament, but allow coaches to vote on and veto those executive orders. I repeat. The board for WSCA will allow the tournament directors to make executive orders about the tournament, but allow coaches to vote on and veto the executive orders. First is the competition. The opponent's counterplan is absolutely competes the opponent. Any firm would entirely be severance, as well as intrinsic disputes severed out of the original implications of the PMC, as well as be intrinsic based upon the original explanation that they gave of the plan text, as well as any firm would have to include things absent the counterplan or the plan text. Reason as to why you rejected it immediately. The second argument is you can't perm because you don't actually allow for it. You can't perm because you do not actually allow for executive orders. Sorry, you can't ban and allow executive orders to exist. That's functional competition. There's no ability for them to ever actually have the ability to affirm this counterplan. Secondarily, on the solvency. The first, I want you to extend across Jessica's argument that she's explained to you about Pacific, in which they all brought all individual coaches together and allowed each of them to have a say. We solve for this is that we make it even more accountable by forcing Marlon, the tournament director, to actually be held accountable to what individuals in the room said. I was not personally in that room, however, I understand that individuals in Marlon did follow the general support of what the individuals were saying in the room. We argue that is already being done status quo. Secondarily, we argue that only has the propensity to continue be underneath the counterplan. If they simply just take away the entirety of the executive order, there's no alternative framework by which could exist any longer for this to functionally happen. Means that tournament decisions do not actually get made. That's going to be the net benefits of the counterplan. But secondarily, okay, net benefits of the counterplan. Oh, sorry. Second solvency, the affirmative does not create a mechanism by which coaches can participate and can at all participate in the tournament decisions, and we are the coaches' inclusion is absolutely essential just for tournament health, because all of you as three individuals, all of you are coaches, you are highly invested in ensuring the activity actually stays and preserves as well as becomes most equitable for all individuals involved. That is always going to be the best mechanism of solvency because a larger body is always going to be better than no mechanism of solvency at all. Net benefit of the counterplan. We save debate, they collapse debate. The first argument is, without a tournament director, tournaments would fall flat on their face. There would be no ability for the tournament director to never make decisions. They simply cannot enforce all of these things in the tournament invitation, and in a world in which they don't do one of these things that they advocate would be in the tournament invitation, what happens? There is no mechanism by which the affirmative plain text would have the ability to solve any of that. It could not be remedied. What, the tournament just doesn't happen then? That means all tournaments collapse because no one understands every single provision as to what is actually going to happen. No one can predict the number of participants that will be in any given event. No one can predict what the brackets will look like before that actually comes to a halt. We argue that the only way that we have the ability to solve for this is allow for conventions to happen at the tournament. Secondarily, you all use the WFA. We argue that the WFA doesn't even exist. It's the Western States Communication Association. The reason as to why our counterpoint has a solvency net benefit over the entirety of yours. But the third argument is the reason as to why the impacts. You can cross-apply all of her arguments about why debate is good, but secondarily, they're not going to solve for the gender inclusion. However, we are when we allow coaches to decide upon different issues external of just breaks and losses. We argue that the WSCA tournament director would be held accountable for all decisions. We argue that's always going to solve that 100% of their arguments. But secondarily, we argue debate is absolutely a good thing. Competitive debate is absolutely key to real-world actual change. You can see across their analysis that they give you about Josh Seafried's the reasons to why we as debaters can become real-world policymakers. We argue you as coaches can also become those policymakers, but you only have the mechanism to do that if you have the voice. The case. She says there are no set rules. You can extend across this argument. This is down in the middle of the background. There's reasons to why there are no set rules in status quo. It means no executive order currently exists. It means your case is straight up not topical. Secondarily, all right, I want you to extend across the argument that NPTE and NPDA do not actually have these provisions in the sense, or sorry, that this association is different than NPDA and NPTE. We are the only kind of penalty able to solve this kind of the case does not isolate any spillover effects. Secondarily, go to the solvency. In the specific instance of Pacific, we are the only case would have the ability to solve. They never isolated any specific analysis to why taking away and revoking the executive order, what the world looks like after that, right? They never articulate to you how that would actually be done. We are the only kind of plan actually guarantees that. We are that any extrapolation that they would make within thus not only be object fiat, but secondarily would make that it would extend beyond the way the plain text was originally read to us. We argue that they can argue for solvency. However, we literally are that solvency, and we are the implementation of the solvency. Means counterpoint always solves 100% better than they do. Advantage one. You all are not going to solve for the discrimination that you all try to highlight on the bottom, especially about race as well as gender, where there's no tournament director provision that would enable them to specifically delineate against those individuals. But secondarily, we argue that allowing the Western States Communication Association to force all coaches voting on this would solve a lot better than they would, from which we have the ability to include other issues, external of just breaking, as well as tournament director procedures, but rather other issues as well, functionally democratizing the entirety of the WSCA. Also, we argue that the tournament director has to be able to make some decisions, and if the tournament director does not have the ability to make those decisions, tournaments go out on their face. That turns the entirety of the tournament cohesion, because none of us even get to come together, right? That link turns the entirety of the cohesion advantage, because we can't even talk to each other. And
any tournament director decision is an executive.
Any tournament director decision is an executive order by functionality.
Okay, it's going to be the same order. Topicality,
What order would that be?
topicality, and then the counterplan, and then case in order.
Thank you.
Are we all ready? Their first interpretation was that revoke means it has to be revoke something that already exists. They talk about that. There are no rules. My first argument is a counter-interpretation that revoke refers to revoking the system. You can specifically look at how this House would revoke the executive orders, not specific to any context, which means that it should be based upon general issues of whether or not the system of an executive order would be able to be maintained, which leads to your second interpretation, which is an XO. It means to, it has specifically to a regional court in Louisiana. Next, for our argument is a counter-interpretation, the executive orders refer to an order which is passed by the head of an organization outside of democratic procedure. Again, an executive order is an order passed by the head of an organization outside of democratic procedure. We have a few net benefits to this interpretation. First of all, it solves back for all of your arguments because we allow for a negrum because it's predicated on whether or not the executive order is good. Your context being in the USFG is something that you provide. Additionally, the next argument is it's the most predictable because both of our schools are upset about it. The third argument is the most real world because the discussion in the WFA business meeting last night was based upon this. Your coach was there, so was ours. The number 4 argument is that it's all of our coaches that talked about, which indicates for why this is also the most predictable. The fifth argument is the third counter-interpretation of the executive order refers to this House. The next argument is that we meet the counter-interpretation because this House is WSCA with the annual tournament, which is the reason for why the executive order only refers to what this House is, which indication that if we are able to win what this House and then the rest follows through. Next argument is you should prefer this because the relevance of the round, specifically this round, shouldn't matter because if they'd taken Phil Sharp's advice, they'd have a partial octos round, which means that it wouldn't matter for us. As it is, we have to win this round to qualify for NPTE, which is the reason for why if they had listed and engaged in democratic participation, that would always going to be able to solve. This is also going to be a net benefit because it's not based upon Phil voting against it, but based upon his input, which is why democratic participation is always going to be better than the ability to veto. Next argument specifically on your standards, you say it's key to ground arguments that we are able to look out for the community, which is always a prerequisite to your negative ground because you are only looking out for yourself. And we are talking about kernel cohesion in general. Next argument, you say framers intent. No explain what this is. Also, I'm pretty sure Jeannie Hunt was the framer, which is the reason for why you argue about wouldn't. Actually, that's a bad argument. Never mind. No explanation why framers intent is no way to be able to verify that. Your third argument on standards was object fiat because you say they use the WSC argument. The object fiat is when you use the object in the round. The subject is this House. The object is the executive order. So an object fiat would be that we say the executive order would abolish itself, which is not what we are doing. Indication that we are not executive orders under voters. You say education. The first response that we precede fairness to education because the executive orders are damaging to the credibility of the tournament, which is the internal link to your voters because your arguments are impossible in a world in which people are leaving debate because it has things like people not having winning records but not being able to break. The next argument is that we have to protect the forum before your voters specifically because arguments that our protection is better because we protect the tournament whereas you just protect your own negative ground, which is a reason for why you couldn't get your negative ground in a world in which it's structurally unfair. Next, you say that not in the topic literature we are winning arguments about why you should prefer this. Additionally, you say competitive equity, but we are going to be ahead on competitive equity because the system that exists right now is a system in which there is no competitive equity because the tournament director can always choose how many rounds there are on the counter plan. The first argument I wanted to hear is that all the LD rounds and the fact that they didn't break people who went third, the 3-2 are all of a disadvantage to the counterplan, specifically because your counterplan is based upon the plan, except coaches can vote and veto. Our argument is that in the LD rounds, there were several coaches who were talking about how there shouldn't be 6 LD rounds, and they were supporting, actually, no one realized the fact that actually it was a system in order to have 3 Northwest people in semis. For example, I was 3-2 with 138 overall and 80 high-low. The Northwest debater who broke was also 3-2 and 81 high-low. There were 2 other 3-2 people, or I don't know, there were 3 other 2 people. There was Somerset, or 2 others, Somerset, another UNR debater, and me, who were all 81 or 82, and yet for some reason, 3 Northwest teams broke to the semis. If you think this is an accident, you should probably look at the cues. Additionally, probably a reason for why people voting and people saying that we shouldn't have a 6th round don't understand the system that exists right now. That is why we should allow for people to be able to have information. Additionally, I want to extend the other argument about how Phil Sharp gave her advice, not specific to him vetoing or him voting on it, but him allowing her to be able to solve. This argument means functionally that the next argument is the permutation, vote affirmative. This is justified because fundamentally the normal means right now is that even if tournament directors do allow to make orders by themselves, it's not surpassing democratic participation. Our interpretation of executive order is that it cannot be in democratic participation. In a world in which we allow for judges to be able to give their insight, it's different than just voting. It allows for Phil to say like, hey, we should do partial octos so more people can get points. That is not him vetoing or voting on it. It's simply only on votes and vetoes allows for the same system in which people don't understand why we're not going to have a 3rd LD or a 6th LD round, but we do anyway. This doesn't fight any of your competition arguments because it's not severance, perm vote through the counterplan. It solves back for all of this. It's only a question of whether or not we're, okay, additionally the next argument. The next disadvantage of the counterplan is we allow for students to be able to have input, which your counterplan completely obfuscates, which is the reason for why being able to have increased participation from the students themselves to be able to come to the tournament directors and say, hey, I was 3-2 and I didn't break. What gives? It's a reason for why you only allow for the coaches to be able to do this, which means you allow for the propensity for coaches to be able to make decisions absent of what their debaters would be able to would want, which is a reason for why any risk of this allows for the impact of the affirmative to be able to happen. On the net benefits, you say that we collapse debate because if there's no executive orders, then there would nothing be able to happen. Our argument specifically is that we were able to check this back because we talk about the fact that the tournament invite can be able to have specific rules about how many rounds there are. It's only an issue of whether or not we can change it right in the middle without telling anybody or without consulting anybody. All of a reason for why we don't actually allow for the collapse of debate. Additionally, when you cross by the other argument, the tournament directors still get the advice of other people, which is a reason for why they still get input, which means that it's not executive order because it's actually allowing for other people's advice. Yeah.
How is perm to the counterplan not severance?
No, perm vote AF.
No, you definitely
said
said
perm
perm due
to
to
the
the counterplan.
My bad. Perm vote AF.
What does that mean?
Yeah, what is that? How is that a perm?
Because it includes the plan and all the counterplan, because we have arguments about why coaches can vote and veto, just like at UOP, people voted on it, even though there wasn't a specific system in place. It also avoids the dissents. On case. First argument is they say there's no system of exos right now. I want you to classify the interpretation on topicality that says that an executive order is when a head of an organization makes a decision without any democratic procedure. All the reason for why, even if there's no system of executive orders, there are still executive orders functionally that take place, as well as all the other reasons about why, since there's no context in the topic, it's just this House would remove or would revoke the executive order. All the reason for why we should be able to choose a specific context. But additionally, I want you to extend the number 3 argument on the background why there's confusion and conflict right now because there is no discussion. This argument is always going to be a net benefit because we are able to access the discussion that the individual debaters have as opposed to simply what the coaches are voting and veto on. All the reason for why there's always a net benefit to the voting affirmative. Additionally, I want you to extend the number 4 argument. The invitation should lay out details. All the reason for why we were able to set up this system. They're going to go hard for the fact that there's no system of executive orders right now, but we were able to create functionally that system by allowing for the invite to say we're going to have 6 LD rounds and that's it. We're not going to suddenly get rid of round 6 because that way more of my debaters can break. Additionally, I want you to extend the number 5 argument that because there's a change, it doesn't follow the NPDA and MPDA rules. They say the counterplan is going to be able to solve, but I want you to extend the fact that people are prevented from breaking specifically. I think it's important in a world in which we get feedback from the individual students because they have different reasons for why they would want to break. For example, like people would want to go to people would want to break as a reason, and they would have a unique connection with that. Nope. Well, I mean, whatever. That is a net benefit because we allow for students to include in discourse on solvency specifically. You say that we don't say what the world looks like. I think you can cross by the arguments before about how we suggest that the invite can have specific rules as a reason for why we do say what the world looks like. But additionally, I want you to extend the number 3 argument that the UOP round 4 or 5 was dropped, but it was actually open to a vote, which is the reason for why there was increased transparency. Look, it wasn't based upon whether or not the system included a vote. It's only a question of whether or not there was needed transparency. Our argument is that in a world in which people are making these executive orders without consulting people, that is the definition of executive order, and that is exactly the same types of things that happened before. What Marlon did was an executive order because he allowed for other people to listen in and allowed for them to engage in a democratic procedure, which is a reason for why there's a fundamental difference in what an executive order is as in the actual implementation. On advance 1. They say that there's no XO to prevent race and gender, discrimination. I want you to extend the argument under the uniqueness that talks about the fact that they're not breaking half the parley fields, and the process should exist, and the controversy that happens, and also the tournament credibility argument, which they conceded, which is the reason why. Because in a world in which tournaments are not credible, people are not willing to go to tournaments, which we say negatively impacts people, especially sophomores, who are thinking about not staying in debate, which is an indication for why that's still a debate allows propensity for like Josh C. and Sarah Mason.
Same order, so that'll be topicality, counterplan, net benefit, case in order. T, counterplan, net benefit. You guys good? First off, on topicality, we're not going for it, but extend across their counter-interpretation where they say that the executive order is the order outside of the democratic procedure. We agree. That's why we think that you're probably going to be preferring the counterplan in this debate. But additionally, they say that they proceed any type of fairness within the round, but you'll see that the counterplan is also able to proceed fairness at the point at which we are taking into account students' thoughts and opinions on what happens as well. Anything else?
No.
There's no reverse voting issue on that topicality because any talk about fairness or education is going to come down to the content of the debate and who's going to be able to solve for that better. We think that's going to be Jonathan and I, and that's why we'll talk about the counterplan now. They say that the LD rounds are a disadd to the counterplan because several coaches didn't want 6 rounds of LD to happen. But first off, we say that the students are allowed to participate because they can go to their coaches and say, look, we really want this 6th round because it means that we could break. We don't exclude students, but if you look to their specific plan in a vacuum, they don't have any type of mechanism by which coaches or students can participate, which means that's probably a reason why you would prefer the counterplan because we allow students to at least go to their coaches. So we say that our democratic process checks back for this. Additionally, they say that Phil Sharp gave the tournament director advice about what to do, which is a reason why their plan is going to be solved. But look, Phil was literally on his knees about having that extra round and also about breaking half the field within parley debate. And guess what? She said, I don't care. This is how it's going to happen, which means that even if these people give their input to the tournament director, unless they have a mechanism by which they can overthrow that vote, only then will they be able to have any type of weight over the tournament director. They don't allow for any type of democratic process to take place, whereas we allow for them to veto and vote on the actual executive order. Additionally, we say, moving on, they say perm, vote, AF. How is that even a perm? They say that they encompass the counterplan, but they don't. If you look to their plan text and their solvency, they literally do not talk about any type of democratic process or how they would increase that. They say that students would be able to participate. We say we encompass this. We give the coaches the tool to veto it. Additionally, we say that this would have been key to solving. For example, at the coaches meeting last night, Phil went around and basically coalition built with NAU and other schools who felt slighted by this tournament director, and he tried to have this process overthrown, but he was not able to because guess what? He didn't have a veto or any type of a vote, which is probably a reason why you're going to be preferring the counterplan. Additionally, they say that they allow students to have input. We say that we precede this because they can give their input to the coach, and the coach would obviously take that into account, considering the coach hopefully wants what's best for their students. Yeah.
Turn severance RBI, or is it turn severance IBI? The perm, extended perm severance.
Additionally, extend across the severance, which we say is an independent voting issue because it means that they are severing out of their advocacy. For example, you can look to the fact that they're suddenly claiming that they allow student involvement and that they allow coaches' involvement, but that's just not true. They don't mention any of this within their plan.
Students create just popular movements, right? That their coaches understand what's better for them. They've been around the activity longer.
Additionally, there's a disadvantage to just allowing students to have the input. We say that students would allow what's popular, but their coaches have the ultimate, in the world of the counterplan, the coaches would have the ultimate say, which we say is better because they want what's best for their students, but additionally, they've been around longer than their students have within the community and they know what needs to happen. Additionally, extend across our solvency where we say that we solve for the coaches meeting and that the only solvency you can have is under the counterplan because we're the only ones that allow a vote and a veto. They do not create a mechanism. The counterplan does. Look, if you buy all the arguments about why the executive order is bad, then that's a reason that you would vote for the counterplan because the people the people, are allowed to overthrow the executive order. But if you go to the net benefit, this is where we talk about why the executive order is key to tournament cohesion. For example, they keep talking about Marlin, which we agree is a great example of how executive orders could have been bad, but additionally we say that this was good because once Marlin went and he had that discussion with people, he went back to the town room and he said, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to drop this round. That's an executive order, probably a reason that you would want Marlin to have it. Additionally, they say tournament invites would check this back. No, obviously not. Marlin wouldn't have been able to foresee this issue, right? He wouldn't have been able to know about the topic getting read wrong and being printed wrong. So that means that he would never be able to fix that issue. In a world in which that happens, they would just have to go for 6 rounds in which all of the negative teams lost on or all of the affirmative teams lost on topicality. If you weren't there, I guess it doesn't really make sense. But the point is that Marlin had to make that executive decision to drop the 5th round after he listened to the people, the students and the coaches. What?
Functional competition. On the perm, please.
Oh, okay. Back on the perm. Functional competition. You can't ban and take away an executive order all at the same time. Additionally, on the net benefit proper, we've already talked about how tournament invites don't fall back. They can't check back for emergencies, but additionally we say that the tournament director has to enforce it all. Additionally, we'll say that tournament invites are probably just as bad as executive orders. If the people don't have a way to veto the rules within the tournament invite, then that means that the tournament director can lay out whatever the hell they want in the invite, which means one of 2 things. Either people will not come to the debate round, which is going to collapse, or come to the debate tournament because they would see it as being unfair and that would collapse debate, or well, we'll articulate that the tournament invite would be bad because it means that people wouldn't show up. Or when they get there, they realize how unfair this is and they don't have any type of check against this unfairness. Additionally, extend across all the impacts of debate being good, the second impact of accountability, and the third point of real world change. Anything else? Also extend across the flipped out argument that Jonathan makes that the WFA does not even exist. That's in their counterplan, or that's in their plan text. Plan in a vacuum. They're just not going to be able to solve for this. But anyway. On the case proper, they say that the executive order is not a democratic procedure. We agree that's your interpretation, which is probably a reason why you don't include students within your plan, because you do not allow for the democratic participation of students. You shouldn't have read that counter-interpretation. Sorry about it. The next argument we make is that the WSCA is different than NPDA and NPTE. They say that they access the discussion of students. You don't access the discussion of students in NPDA or NPTE, but additionally the status quo calls for that because there are already discussions happening. Additionally, they say that the tournament invite said that the tournament invite would solve back for the LD problems because it would mean 6 LD rounds. Then across the double bind where I say that the tournament invite is just as bad as an executive order, especially if the people are not able to vote on it and veto. Additionally, they say, again, Jonathan said that they don't articulate what the world looks like post-plan. They say the invite will solve back for that, but the invite is as bad as the executive order. Additionally, they say that people being prevented from baking means that we can go to talk to them and have their input. We are the only mechanism by which to solve back for this. If Marlin goes to the students and he says, how do you feel about not breaking? They'd be like, it's unfair. He could go back and be like, I don't really care because my team's all broke, so sucks for you guys. But if the coaches are involved and the coaches see that their teams weren't able to break as a result of it, then they can veto the executive order. This is the way that the democratic system works in America. The Congress can legislate over executive orders. Probably is a good example of this. Additionally, on community cohesion, Jonathan talks about how the directors wouldn't necessarily account for gender and race. They're not answering this. Additionally, Jonathan makes the argument that this is absolutely the wrong forum for your argument. You should definitely be going to WSCA's conferences tomorrow and doing it there. But additionally, we said that the tournament,
It would be worse because it would collapse debate.
But additionally, it would always be worse because it would collapse debate in a world in which the tournament director cannot respond to emergencies like Marlin was able to. We say that the Pacific example was probably a good example of how things will work, except for that the people will have a binding veto on the tournament director.
Counterplay, case in order. Okay, fine. Topicality. Counterplan, case in order. I don't know what happened to my T. Counterplan, case in order. There will be an overview. It will be awesome if all of you would love it. Everyone ready? Cool. This decision is really easy for you three judges, and here is why. You have functionally a counterplan versus plan debate. You're not going to buy the perm. They straight up didn't answer all of our preempts in the LSU show. So it becomes counterplan versus plan. Plan functionally revokes an ability. Counterplan allows that ability to maintain an effect, but makes them accountable. The only advantages that are being claimed off of plan are accountability. That is the only thing that they are claiming. However, the counterplan solves 100% for all of those concerns by allowing the coaches to become involved. We encapsulate the entirety of the students to become involved as well, to the point where they can be represented by their coaches. That means they do not have a unique piece of offense against the counterplan whatsoever. There's absolutely no reason as to why we should revoke executive privileges and not allow for some form of veto power by the coaches. Where the counterplan is what the case would have resulted in if they would have been extra topical, but they didn't. They can't do that. The counterplan does, however, have the power to do that, and will always win on that solvency deficit level. Go ahead.
Can you just note the fact that we agree that this is not run properly, which is why we won't.
Yeah, this is a new argument, but I hope you guys know this. We absolutely agree that this is messed up, right? But we are just trying to find the best solution for this overall to happen, right? And we wanted to make that clear to everyone and the video that, yeah, we do agree it's kind of messed up. Topicality. First, extend across their counterinterpretation, specifically of executive order. It's going to be damning to them because it's not a democratic process by which individuals can participate. Secondarily, extend across Kelly's RBI arguments, just in case somebody thought that it needed to be extended in the LOR counterplan. There is no perm. He does not answer the functional competition. He does not answer severance as an IVI. If they want to go for the perm, they will fight that IVI. Any new answer by Jessica will be new, and the PMR will be point of order. Secondarily, none of their disadvantages that are trying to isolate the counterplan would not be encapsulated via the counterplan. They are not accounting for what the fact is coaches actually have the ability to do once they get the veto power. They have the ability to solve for this 3-2 problem because tournament directors can no longer say, 5 rounds, I control top seed, 5 rounds, done. No, because all you understand and you all have the ability to look at cumes. Students, we can't do that. We're locked out of the tab room, but as coaches, you all are put in a unique position by which you can balance your students' needs as well as the needs of individual, as well as the needs of the tournament, right? Dale, I understand you guys can't actually get in the tab room. My argument was that you have the ability to overall see like the overall functionings of a tournament, right? As well as you all have seen more tournaments than we have. I can only debate for 4 years. You all can be around for a lot longer than that. You can understand broader general trends in the activity. Only coaches have the ability to solve for that. Secondarily, I want you to extend across all the arguments that they are making on the dissent counterplan. Kelly straight up turns the idea that students would somehow be better for participation. Students are good for participation. We agree. However, they should be represented via their coaches. Otherwise, it just revolves into mayhem and individual students just voting for whatever's popular. You can see this in NPDA business meetings. Moreover, on the net benefit, the net benefit is the unique reasons why you vote for the counterplan. They are straight up not answering the arguments that we are putting here as to why there are emergencies that happen that simply cannot be predicted in the tournament invitation. You cannot predict the number of competitors. You can extend across the original LC analysis. I know all of you can flow. That's a reason as to why this is going to be absolutely paramount that you vote for the counterplan, as well as extend Kelly's tournament invite a double bind. Either it's unfair, people don't show up, and there's absolutely no community cohesion, or there's absolutely no check against the tournament cohesion, where that only the counterplan has the ability to solve for that double bind. Secondarily, you vote on the impacts of the net benefit outweighing the entirety of case. Moreover, go to case now. The arguments that are happening on the solvency debate are pretty good. You can extend those across. Secondarily, the stats goal 100% solves for the entirety of their analysis that they're trying to give. On the advantage, this is the only unique leverage they could have had against the counterplan, but they're dropping no internal link analysis to specific disadvantaged groups, specifically in Parley. You have absolutely no internal link, but secondarily, how you all collapse debate to the point where there's no longer a tournament director that can make decisions in emergencies. That means what? Tournaments just literally don't happen when a problem arises because no one has the ability to make that authority anymore. Where only the counterplan solves for that unique net benefit as well as that solvency deficit. Look, the decision is pretty simple, right? You can also extend their counterinterpretation as reasons why they do not actually solve for this argument whatsoever, but also why they can't access any of the democratic participation arguments that they are trying to claim. Also, this decision is pretty simple. You vote for the counterplan because it actually has the ability to solve for a case, has the net benefit, as well as solves back for the double bind argument that we are presenting to you. Thank you.
Okay. So, I am going to just touch on topicality real quick. And then I am going to go on to counterplan. And then net benefits of counterplan. And then case of order. So they're conceding our interpretation on the topicality that the executive orders are orders without democratic process, which means it's only an executive order if the person acts without anyone else's advice. So the example of Marlin is not is like only going into our direction. But we would also say that the example of being able to previously have a board decide whether or not the invitation is legitimate and have that board oversee the executive director's decisions is always going to check back and always going to be a reason as to why there's a net benefit to the voting for the affirmative that the counter plan does not touch. When we're not going for the perm, there's no reason as to why you should be preferring those arguments. So go to the counter plan now. My argument specifically here is going to be that removing the executive order is always going to be a prerequisite to deciding how the voting system works, which means that the affirmative is always going to be a prior question to the counterplan, which means that we're the only ones that can actually decide whether or not an executive order is an effective way to create a democratic process. I think that both of us have seen that this is actually not the way to go about doing things, which means that in a world in which this is true, the only way to solve is by voting for the affirmative.
Order. I think this argument, well, it could be a re-articulation of different arguments, I don't understand. I think the argument that the app exists as a prereq to counterplan is new in the PMR and could have been in the MG.
Yeah, I guess that's just like a reframing of the same arguments that have been made about like our interpretation of the executive order on the topicality and how that functions within the counterplan and the affirmative. I'm just like weighing the impacts of how that plays out in the round. Take it into consideration. Okay. All right, so their second argumentation here is that coaches should always have the final say over what goes on because they're around more. Our argument specifically here is that this is a unique benefit. The reason that you're going to be preferring the affirmative is because the student voices should always be preferred. We're not saying that they should be preferred over the judges or over the coaches or over the executive directors. We're simply saying that they should be on an equal playing field. We specifically argue that new voices in the community is always going to be a way to adhere to the community cohesion that we're trying to solve for and the advantage. And the only way to actually be able to do this is by voting for the affirmative, because we're the only ones that allow an equal weighing mechanism for the voices of the students as well as the coaches to be valued on even ground, which we would argue is always going to be the internal link to both fairness and education within the debate community, which is something that both teams are advocating for, so vote out. So they're specifically saying that Phil Sharp said that like he got on his hands and knees and said that he didn't want this to happen, specifically about the LD rounds and the way that they were breaking parliamentary teams, but this is exactly our point. In a world in which there's no executive order, she isn't able to just be like, no, this is not how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to do it my way instead. In a world in which we eliminate in all executive orders, this is always going to be a precursor to deciding how they're going to go about fixing the problems that exist. But also our solvency, this becomes really, really important. They drop our specific argumentation about how removing the executive order means that they must clearly delineate the rules of the tournament ahead of time in the invitation. This not only checks back against any problems created by those rules because people know ahead of time what they're getting themselves into when they attend a tournament, but it's also a reason as to why the affirmative, passing the affirmative plan is the only way to create that accountability within the debate community specifically. We would argue that this is a reason as to why you're going to be preferring the affirmative and why the counterplan has no unique net benefit to voting for it. We would also argue that allowing for the prior binding of the rules for the invitation is always going to be that net benefit that you're going to be preferring. They say that the veto is the only way to solve back for this, but our specific argument here is that a veto system would just cause the problems that we indict, right? Because in a world in which one person has complete control over what decisions are being made, we would argue that this is pretty similar to an executive order, and the reason that all the problems that happened in this tournament in the first place is because of the fact that one person had the majority of the calls being made about about the way that the tournament functions. Our argument here specifically is that a veto would just replicate these problems in the new system, and that's something that you can't avoid.
Point of order.
The problems being replicated in the new system is new.
What argument did you make on it?
What argument are you saying is new?
The argument that this is like that the veto problem would be replicated in the new system, and that somehow the coaches' veto is worse is new.
Framing it in terms of the veto is new. I made the argument that the judges or the coaches can make decisions absent of what their students would want, which would recreate the problems.
Yeah, I guess I'm just rewording, but I really it's the same argument.
Cool.
Okay. And also a second net benefit to voting for the affirmative is that the fact that allowing for student voices to be heard uniquely is something that would allow for specifically students from the Northwest to come up and be like, hey, we don't necessarily support the decisions that are being made, which is a reason as to why you're always going to be preferring student voices, because we shouldn't indict an entire school or an entire tournament director just because of the bad decisions that are being made because of the system that exists in the status quo. Our argument here is the only way to solve back for this is by voting affirmative.
They say students only vote on what's popular. Make the argument that
Okay, they say that students are only going to vote for what's popular, but our argument here is that like debate students want to be here because they like the fact that we are able to discuss educational things that are going on in the status quo. Our argument here is not that, yeah, the competitive equity is always going to be a prior question to whether, to like how they vote. I don't think that just because like they want to cause problems, debaters are going to vote just because like they somehow get the benefit. In a world in which we are all like moving towards community cohesion, that's something that is always going to be a net benefit to the affirmative and something that the counterplan cannot capture.
They said that using the tournament invite would be bad because it's like
Okay, so they say that allowing for that the tournament invite is always going to be bad because because people like won't show up if they don't like the rules. But when a world in which the affirmative allows for the check of these kinds of things, because of the fact that they have a board now overseeing these decisions rather than the executive director, that's always going to mean that the affirmative solves best. But also in a world in which we don't allow for executive orders, and when something comes up at a tournament, this allows for a new democratic process to form in the wake of what exists in the status quo. Our argument here specifically is that allowing for the veto is always going to be allowing for the things that exist now to continue to reinvent themselves in the system, which is something that the affirmative is always going to solve back for it. So go to our arguments. Just like to clear up the fact that the Western Forensic Association doesn't exist, it does exist. This is our solvency mechanism, it definitely does exist. So our specific argument is that now that the board is here to check back all of the decisions being made by the executive director, that's always going to solve better than allowing for a veto, because it just creates the problems that we condemn, and we would argue that community cohesion is something that should be valued in this debate.